Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's lecture program sponsored by the Army Heritage Center Foundation. Tonight, we're pleased to have Professor Watson back for a second time. Tonight, he's here to discuss a very relevant topic and one I would assume was in the 2014 book, which is Very Reluctant Policemen, Army Aid to Civil Powers in Jacksonian Urban Unrest and Political Disputes. Good evening, Professor Watson. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mike. Welcome. I actually did not put much of this in either of my books because so much of what the Army and Army officers did as national policemen was on the frontiers and the borders and not internally. Hence, today's title, which I adapted to Very Reluctant Policemen. In fact, this evening's talk is the story of a dog that didn't bark, that officers in the Army generally were not involved in aid to the civil power against urban rioting or in election disputes or what have you. Or when they were involved, it was to intimidate and deter, say in the Nullification Crisis in South Carolina in 1832, if you want to think of that as a political dispute. Or maybe to be a reserve to potentially back up state and local forces, as in the Dorr War in Rhode Island in 1842, which was a dispute over the extent of the suffrage, over who could vote, and the Rhode Island Constitution, and who had been elected governor, and so forth. But in fact, the Army did remarkably, perhaps surprisingly little policing in the manner that it's done, say, during Hurricane Andrew or in the LA riots back in 92, or in other cases, since at least the 1960s. Now, I have to give the standard disclaimer. What I'm saying here is these are my own views. They're not the views of the Department of History of West Point, or of West Point, or of the Department of the Army, or of the Department of Defense, or the United States government. So I guess I should say for a moment how I came to this topic. Again, just sort of doing wide-ranging research, and when I started out my dissertation back in the 1990s, I was really didn't have a strong sense of where I was going, so I was researching anything and everything I could find about the Army Officer Corps between the end of the War of 1812 and the War with Mexico, and in the process picked up a lot of stuff, wrote a big long dissertation. In the end, it focused down, and for the books that came out 20 years later, to the officer corps in the Army in the borderlands and on the frontiers, doing what we might call policing. But the manuscripts were so long that my press did want me to cut a little bit here and there, not too much. That they were good about that, and I basically cut the stuff on coastal defense, which I had published as an article, and didn't have a whole lot more, and was not as interesting to me as the frontier and borderland stuff. And then I also cut out this material and related material on the Army's involvement with the repression, or more usually the intimidation or deterrence of slave unrest, and other related kind of internal security and internal policing matters. So as I was finishing up the book manuscripts around 2010, I started thinking, I need to turn this research into article manuscripts, which I'm still slowly in the process of doing, having, after finishing the books, gone over to edit a volume of the West Point History of Warfare, and then two volumes of the published hardback West Point Histories of Warfare. So what you're seeing on the screen, the PowerPoint here, I haven't keyed these to specific points in my talk. as much, again, because I don't have a bunch of pictures of, soldiers and officers, restraining rioters or shooting rioters or what have you. Rather, you see here some images first of Jacksonian Democracy, although painted by a Whig, George Caleb Bingham. The very first one, you have a speaker, an earnest speaker, trying to persuade the voters. And then you see, again, voters, but some of them a little tipsy, some of them a little bedraggled. So the Whigs, kind of conservative, somewhat elitist view of the wider electorate, with universal white male suffrage, no property requirements. And then you see here some of the books. I find in class it's often good to just show some book covers, books that I used as sources or that I dug through trying to find things, and generally didn't find things, didn't find the Army playing the role that we might have expected it to. And so, first we had the three primary books on Jacksonian era rioting. Here in this slide that's up right now, you have books on more specific riots or urban protest. Technically you would call abolitionists trying to free a refugee from slavery a riot, but, politically, particularly today, we might, legally it was a riot, but we might tend to call it we would call what they call it a rescue or a protest. And then, of course, a violent protest, a riot, that spectrum. Here in this slide, that was a anti-abolition riot in, I think, 1834. And now in this slide, you have, as the abolitionist movement was either repressed or kind of withdrew back into itself a bit by the 1840s. Interestingly, the abolitionist riots tended to fade. I'm not really sure why. That would make a really good subject for someone to do research. And in the 1840s, you start seeing a lot of riots are between Protestants and Catholics or native-born and immigrants. So if you think of gangs in New York, that's gangs in New York on a larger scale. Here in this slide, we have the Army in the Borderlands. So my book, Durwood Ball's book, which is really the book on the 1850s, has a variety of case studies. It's sort of like my book from before. And then Mullis's book on specifically Kansas. So this is just to remind you, what the Army is doing during the 1830s primarily is forcing Native Americans out of, from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. Now in practice, this is a good slide because the Army by and large did not escort Native Americans along the Trail of Tears, right? That's supposed to be the Cherokee. The Cherokee by and large said, okay, we want to do the removal ourselves. We don't want you guys watching us running this. So the government largely allowed them, Ross and people like him to do that. The Army was involved in rounding up Native Americans, forcing them into concentration points, whatever term you would like to use there. And then from there, they would go west. But by and large, with a few exceptions, you don't have like groups of soldiers along with the Indians being forced to move west. Once they had been rounded up, the chance that they were, some would flee, would try to escape and go back to their old homes. But given that there were masses of white settlers moving in, and often moving into those homes, those farms directly or burning them down, but by and large, once they had been rounded up, the Americans didn't have a good option to remain or to return back to their homes. So you often had individual Army officers involved who would go along with the Native American group, basically as commissary officers, supply officers, to arrange for food, to make contracts or to enforce contracts. But in any case, you can see that there were some other examples right at the end of images or books regarding rioting in the Jacksonian period. And, when those come up, I'll mention them again. In the early 1800s, the armies of Europe, after Napoleon's defeat, faced inward to support their own pretty reactionary social and political order by policing the peasants and the urban workers of their own countries. Again, here on the screen right now, you see a sort of positive image of Jacksonian democracy, right? Earnest speaker, thoughtful, reflective listeners. The U.S. Army served a similar function, maintaining a very hierarchical social and political order in the slave states, where national military power provided the ultimate resource or the ultimate resort against slave insurrection. But the Army was not a significant factor in the construction of northern social relations, whether you want to call those class relations or labor relations or whatever, until the Civil War or even after. Despite a sustained surge in large-scale urban rioting that began in 1834 and extended throughout the Jacksonian and antebellum eras, so several decades of really, frequent rioting, largely by whites, sometimes against the small numbers of African American communities in northern cities, but largely against each other, again, for religious reasons, over immigration, or for any number of reasons. I mean, you have riots against prostitution, you have riots against you have riots for virtually, for election disputes, are very common, especially as the Jacksonian era goes on. Virtually anything that might bring them to riot brought them to riot. So despite that surge in rioting, the soldiers of the National Standing Army, who were so maligned by populist and Jacksonian Democrats as authoritarians and martinets, and the sort of people who were perhaps likely to, want to, shoot the people and force the people to do the bidding of elites. Nevertheless, the soldiers of the National Standing Army never, literally never, that I could find, and certainly there's possibility of more evidence, but all these different books, they don't mention it. All that the Army documents I looked at, they don't mention it. You don't see references to newspapers mentioning the Army using deadly force against civilians under a killer of authority in a dispute between citizens prior to the Civil War. So of course, they're attacking, fighting, conquering Native Americans, but you don't see them intervening in, say, an election riot and shooting down one side or the other. That there are a couple cases when they were removing whites who were squatting on Indian land, trying to pave the way for removing or expelling Indians to western Mississippi. There were a couple cases when you would have whites who would refuse to leave the land, and things would get out of hand, and usually between an enlisted soldier and there'd be a tussle, and there were a couple cases when citizens were bayoneted or shot. But even there, very, very rarely compared to what might have been the case. So as a body, the soldiers of the National Standing Army and their officers were not and did not want to be significant actors in all this rioting and this political and social violence that was scourging the nation. Nor were they actors, nor did they, on the whole, want to be actors in the nation's partisan politics. And this paper is largely to explain why, as well as to give you some examples where they talked about it or where they were called on, but didn't take any action, or their action didn't result in any lethal violence. And I would say even during the Civil War, I'm not going to go beyond that, I'm not really going to go into that, but even during the Civil War, Army operations to aid the civil power in the North, as well as in Confederate Army operations in the South, are probably most accurately interpreted as contingent wartime measures. The repression of draft resistance and dissent during the war, about the war, to support the war, rather than larger structural elements, right? They're not. It's not part of like I don't know, a plan or a vision to reshape American society, saying more authoritarian way. Now, soldiers and actually usually free soil guerrillas exchanged fire in Kansas on several occasions during the spring of 1858. You know, bleeding Kansas is pretty well documented. And there were frequent incidents between individual soldiers and Mormon militants when the Army was sent to enforce U.S. sovereignty over Utah, also during the late 1850s. But I've only found one case, only one, in which federal troops actually fired. You know, of course, they often had their bayonets and, you know, would sort of use their bayonets to prod or push or, you know, people along. But where they actually fired on civilians, again, under color of authority, you know, ordered, you know, at the orders of officers during a political or a labor dispute between citizens between 1815 and John Brown's reign. And that one instance was in 1857 when the Marines fired on Know Nothing rioters. The Know Nothings were a anti-immigrant. They had it was called the American Party, but they had other elements to their platform, but above all, they were known as being anti-immigrant or nativist, right, pro-native born. And these Know Nothing rioters had fired on the Marines deployed in Washington, had fired on them with pistols and actually had a cannon, which tells you how out of control things sometimes were. That in these riots, like there's a Cincinnati riot in the 1850s I think that's like an anti-prostitution riot. And the rioters have a cannon, right? No doubt, not a huge cannon, but you know, a light field gun that they're tugging around, and I think in that case maybe firing at the house of prostitution. So things are pretty wild, but surprisingly, the Army is not very much involved in that wildness. That incident in 1857 with the Marines and rioters does demonstrate the potential for the sort of military violence that Americans usually associated with European monarchies. When the Marines fired on the rioters, they actually killed 10 of them and wounded 25. So they literally, you know, they fired a volley or perhaps several volleys at probably pretty close range to inflict those casualties. But that's the only case, right? So, you know, I'm going to mention a number of instances, but on the whole, everything I say in this paper is an exception. And so ultimately, you know, these are interesting kind of anecdotal cases, but the bigger question is, why was this so rare given the frequency of riots, the frequency of disputes in which sometimes politicians or political groups sought military assistance. So historically, law enforcement along the U.S. borders and frontiers has provided ample occasion for federal military aid to civil authorities. That's, you know, I wrote 2 fairly large books about that, and then there are others have been written as well. From the slide you can see. But civil and military leaders alike have normally tried, both commonly and as a norm, have tried to avoid using national military power in law enforcement directed at citizens, and I think we have to say particularly at white citizens within the nation's core. And a good example might be during World War I, when there was a lot of rioting by whites against African Americans in cities, beginning, say, in East St. Louis in 1917, and then you think Chicago, what was called the Red Summer, which in this case meant bloody red rather than communist or socialist or anything. And by and large, although National Guard units were sent in, I don't think regulars were sent in, but generally they were sent in. They arrived a day or two or sometimes several days into it. You can also think like the Tulsa riot of whites against African Americans in 1921. And they would essentially arrive after the damage had been done. So the national government and national military officers were very reluctant to use force against the people who voted in the 1800s and most of the 1900s. And it's probably not coincidental to note, large-scale urban rioting in the second half of the 60s, voting rights for African Americans in the second half of the 60s. Right? There's probably some interesting coincidences or connections there. But during the 1800s, apart from Reconstruction, which would take us well beyond the scope of what I want to do today, apart from Reconstruction, the U.S. Army was normally able to avoid engagement in law enforcement within the states. Now, out of the territories, a bit of a different matter, but in the states, which a lot of people at the time believed were sovereign, or at least equally sovereign or separately sovereign, to the federal government, Army tried to stay out of, didn't want to get sucked into any conflicts within the states. However, civil authorities did seek the Army's assistance in several cases of urban and partisan violence during the 1830s and 40s, particularly during riots in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. in 1835. And my talk today examines Army officers' reactions to these and several other cases of military aid to the civil power, focusing on the 1830s and 40s at the height of the Jacksonian era, to think about their relationship with civilian authority, their subordination, or perhaps lack of, but I would say on the whole, their subordination to civilian authority, their autonomy and insulation from civilian political dynamics, from the ferocious partisanship in the era, and their relative objectivity or impartiality, at least in behavior, regardless of their own personal beliefs in conflicts with partisan overtones or implications. The Army certainly had extensive experience in law enforcement against white citizens, again, mostly on the borders and the frontiers, trying to keep peace between whites and Indians, which frequently required actually threatening white citizens and destroying their property, the houses they had built on Indian land, in order to get them to leave the Indian land, per the trade and intercourse laws. And usually then the idea was to kind of keep the Indians happy so that they would be more likely to accept being forced to leave that land eventually. But some other examples, federal troops were dispatched to enforce customs laws along the Canadian and Texan borders on several occasions during the late 1830s or 1820s and the early 1830s. There was a sort, there were customs officers, but they, like most law enforcement officials, depended on posses of some sort, people that they would essentially deputize and pay some, usually a specific fee for the service of serving on a posse to usually intimidate people into, accepting their enforcement of the law. But sometimes the Army would be called on to do that, and there had been a good example of that, extensive example of that, in Thomas Jefferson's and Bar Grove trade back in 1808, early 1809, against basically trade with Britain and France, but really against all trade. So actually a really intensive involvement that, again, didn't really result in a lot of violence by the Army, or a lot of direct violence, a lot of physical violence by the Army against citizens. In 1829, responding to a request from federal civil officials at Key West, which was supported by the territorial governor and the congressional delegate from Florida, an infantry company was deployed to uphold U.S. national sovereignty in the face of what were called piratical associations and infractions of the law of nations attempted by vessels of foreign nations, which wasn't really clear who or what that meant, but American officials were probably concerned because Mexico had expelled Spanish subjects in 1828 and 1829, and a lot of them went to Key West, and what their motives were or how they would subsist was unclear. No martial law was authorized or declared, but President Adams, John Quincy Adams, apparently considered the presence of military force essential to the functioning of civil authority on Key West. Thus, Army Commanding General Alexander Macomb instructed Florida Commander George Mercer Brooke to protect the place from lawless adventurers and to enable the magistracy and the courts to carry into effect the laws and decrees amid what he called a heterogeneous congregation of individuals of all nations, most of them unacquainted with our laws and by habit respecting only military force. But this is, Key West, kind of again, far edge of American sovereignty. And General Macomb usually sought to concentrate troops wherever possible in order to improve their training, to bring troops together in larger numbers so they could do more training and drill. And so things like customs enforcement or, safeguarding American sovereignty and law and order on Key West seemed like a distraction. And the Army's hierarchy reacted by removing those troops as soon as they could, right? By abandoning those duties as soon as they were allowed to do so, which is usually pretty quickly. And they did the same way, reacting to a series of demands by state governors for troops to deter slave unrest between 1829 and 1831. So, for example, in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, troops were deployed from Fortress Monroe, down near Norfolk. Troops were deployed to patrol the countryside to deter further slave unrest, but they didn't actually engage in combat. And usually the local militias would seize slaves and punish slaves or commit physical violence against the slaves. And again, by and large, Army officers responding, they would respond respectfully, but essentially they would say, hey, it's okay, Southern political leaders back then were always afraid that slaves were about to rebel. So, Army officers would generally try to reassure them and not have to rush out to, run around the countryside looking for, slaves who were generally already, pretty well scared to death and, not about to engage in some immediate rebellion. Now, Andrew Jackson, who had suspicions about the Standing Army, its officers, the military academy, had criticized them all at one point or another, but Jackson showed no more hesitation than John Quincy Adams deploying national military forces in civil emergencies. One of the more unusual uses of federal military power to guard the nation's borders, if you will, came when General Macomb ordered Captain Matthew M. Payne to aid the Baltimore city authorities in establishing a quarantine, very current, during the cholera epidemic of 1832. Doing that was not unprecedented. European armies frequently did so and had done so going back to at least the 1500s. And did so continuing throughout the 19th century. And the U.S. Army had enforced quarantines in Louisiana during the first years of American government in Louisiana 3 decades before. The Army also provided Fort Lafayette as a lazaret, a medical holding facility, when cholera struck New York City in 1831, but no force appears to have been employed by federal troops to keep people from coming in or into the city, for example. And there was no significant public reaction against the limited use of national military resources, the coordination of the public space in these emergencies. Most references to military forces in domestic disorders are actually to militia or citizen soldier volunteers, and scholars often fail to note the distinction, which is important for assessing the regular Army's mission and the dynamics of American federalism, the relationship between the federal government and the nation as a whole and the states. So federal military forces actually played little role in the urban violence of the Jacksonian period, despite rioting that reached levels not matched until the 1960s. And federal military commanders usually sought and were permitted to avoid entanglement in partisan electoral disputes that caused so much rioting during these years. Thus, the statement by distinguished Jackson historian Robert Remini that Jackson, quote, ordered federal troops to put down civil disorders on more occasions than any previous president might appeal to us. You know, we think of Jackson as an authoritarian leader who was very quick to violence. But that's not an accurate picture of the Army's missions or its significance in the United States, in the politics or in the power dynamics in the United States. Similarly, assertions by leading labor historians that, quote, time and again, working people were confronted by rifles and bayonets wielded by the regular army. Statements like that actually mix incidents from across the 19th century, blurring and confusing patterns of action and trajectory of change. Now, after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, we do see American military forces and the National Standing Army engaged in repressing the strikes, the Great Strike, the Railroad Strike, and other associated strikes in 1877, again in 1886, again in 1892 and 1894, the Pullman Strike, the Pullman Car Strike, and mining strikes in Idaho at Coeur d'Alene. So we do see a lot of that later in the century. So something changed. I'm not going to have time to discuss that today, but it is worth thinking, about asking, wondering why that changed. Military power was actively employed repressing the religious and ethnic riots in cities like Philadelphia during the 1830s and 40s. Dozens were slain when soldiers opened fire during the Astor Place riot, which was over a theater. It was literally over, one group of people liked one actor and another group of people liked another actor. And when the one actor was chosen over the other, the other actor's supporters rioted and essentially attacked the theater, the Astor Place. But the troops who fired on the rioters and killed dozens of them were citizen soldiers, state and local militia and volunteers, enforcing state and local priorities and involved in state and local political dynamics, the dynamics of New York City politics and New York City society, rather than federal or national ones. And, if you read widely enough, you can certainly find letters, especially from junior officers, that suggest that companies stationed in coastal fortifications were warned to prepare themselves for deployment during various riots, like the ones in Philadelphia in 1844. But the Army never, literally never, not once, actively intervened in a major urban riot before the Civil War, like actually deployed and actually bayoneted or shot or pushed back or whatever crowd control technique you might imagine the rioters or protesters. Rumors that say horse artillery had been dispatched to Philadelphia in 1844 may have been derived from their deployment, horse artillery, to Rhode Island during the constitutional conflict in there 2 years before. The rumors suggest the seriousness of the violence in Philadelphia, that you would actually be, people would be talking about deploying artillery, that could fire essentially, canister. But the decision not to actually deploy the horse artillery, or, may not even be a decision. So we've got a rumor and, But not deploying the horse artillery demonstrates the government's desire to avoid embroilment and the Army's desire to avoid embroilment as long as local citizen soldiers were capable of controlling disorder, which either they were or they felt they were, and so they didn't actually call on the Army to intervene. A decade later, in the 1850s, the presence of the National Standing Army angered abolitionists who were attempting to free fugitive slave Anthony Burns from federal custody in Boston in 1854. But this law, the Fugitive Slave Law from 1850, was so clearly partisan in a small p sense, as well as partisan in largely being supported by Democrats at that time, and so unpopular where it was enforced in northern cities where southern slaveholders wanted the government or wanted northern citizens to help them seize people who had escaped from slavery. So it was so unpopular that the pro-slavery Democratic administrations of the 1850s almost always preferred to use federal marshals leading locally mobilized posses rather than raising more hackles by deploying the standing army that they themselves claimed to fear. The very last slide in the slide packet actually had the cover of a book on the Anthony Burns case, and on that cover you see there's a picture of Anthony Burns, then you see lots of soldiers. Now federal troops were deployed in that one case, but they saw it as a test case. In the very last one in the lower right-hand corner there, right? So you see all those soldiers. First off, that's not their uniforms. Their uniforms were a lot less ornate than that. Those are definitely militia volunteer, basically trying to show off for their neighbors or their wives or their girlfriends or whomever. The Army did actually deploy some horse artillery in that instance, but that deterred any the abolitionists didn't try to attack the artillery to save Anthony Burns. And the Pierce administration only saw this as a test case. It was saying, look, we can do this. Fugitive slave law is a law. We're going to enforce the law. But they didn't follow that precedent with further use of national forces in other cases. Civil officials, who were, in these cases were usually state and local, right? So New York City, mayor, preferred to rely on forces that were more directly responsive to their control, right? That they could command the militia or the volunteers, from their city or from within the state, and wouldn't have to deal with, these officers coming from the National Army and maybe, disagreeing with their authority. In the rare cases where federal troops were deployed, they tended to be the Marines. And there's a kind of simple geographic reason for this. The Marines were quartered very conveniently in downtown Navy yards, and they were already experienced using coercion to discipline sailors aboard ships. That was really the primary function of the Marines as an institution at that point. Thus, for example, Marines were used when refugees from slavery fought back against slave catchers at Christiana in southeast Pennsylvania in 1851. And that Marines were the forces led by Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee against John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Alan R. Millett, the historian who also wrote a history, probably the major history of the Marine Corps, adds a case from, I think, the 1830s when Marines were sent to quell a deadly prison riot. But the Army, not so much, for whatever reason. The Army, for a number of reasons that we're talking about here, the Army had no military police force of its own. There was not a military police branch. There was no formal provost marshal. So there wasn't like a designated force that could be deployed in the way that military police units have sometimes been deployed in the last 20, 30 years. To assist civil authorities in cases of urban unrest. The seaboard garrisons that say, like in New York City, were often physically isolated on islands and harbors like Fort Columbus. But most important, few politicians, Whig or Democratic, right? Whigs more conservative, more elitist, more hierarchically minded maybe, but Whig or Democratic, few politicians or military leaders wanted to employ the Army on such missions. No matter what their ideological perspective was, calling on the National Standing Army to shoot or bayonet or potentially shoot or bayonet or be in a situation where something might get out of control and they would end up shooting or bayoneting citizens, voters, would be a last resort. Deploying the Army against what pundits and politicians back then called the people outdoors was a confession of failure so complete as to ruin a politician's career and perhaps an Army officer's career, although they had some insulation. But This reluctance was matched by the public neutrality of professional military commanders whose general social conservatism, right, whatever their personal belief, also included the hope to avoid getting embroiled in divisive missions like riot policing, which would undermine the Army's nascent legitimacy as a national force, performing missions for the good of the nation, right? And so most people, one way or another, could agree on using the Army to, take land from Mexico. Most people could agree on using the Army to take land from Native Americans, right? Most people could agree on using the Army to, deter the British. But when you get into riots in the cities, you have a lot of criticism, and the Army didn't want that. The tone for this was set in 1834. When asked for assistance by the mayor of New York during political riots, the local commander declined, believing himself without any authority to intervene, and he was sustained by Eastern Department Commander Winfield Scott. The Army's leaders could have sided with civilians, probably conservative elites, who would demand law and order against populist rioters, and they might have won even greater support from the emerging Whig Party if they had done so. But you then have to think, how would the already antagonistic Democrats, who so often criticized the Army, even if they really didn't do anything, anything to limit the Army, even though they actually increased the size of the Army and increased the pay of the Army and all kinds of things, basically gave the Army everything it was asking for in a law in 1838. But how would the Democrats react? And the Democrats held the presidency for 24 out of the 32 years during the pre-Civil War era. Right? So the president, if the president is a Democrat, you probably don't want to go, potentially shooting rioters who were often Democrats or, were likely to vote Democratic. Career military officers could not avoid policing the international borders and frontiers, even though they often found those missions distasteful as well. What they really wanted to do was, train and, prepare to fight wars against the British and, look gallant and brave and courageous and, defeat European adversaries and gain glory. But officers would hardly take the initiative to seek duty even more dangerous to their fledgling claims to nonpartisanship and professional autonomy, right? They don't want to become identified with the Whigs when the Democrats are usually the majority, in Congress and usually hold the presidency in this period. Now, the Whigs were a substantial party. They were usually getting, 45, 47% of the vote. So, it's not like the Democrats were the only party or the overwhelming party, but, you don't want to alienate either side. And I think that's, true today as well. Individual officers, usually junior officers, a little less experienced, maybe a little less mature, occasionally did take note of urban rioters, probably with immigrants, Catholics, and Democrats uppermost in mind, using much the same conservative and authoritarian language they used about white American citizens invading Canada or intruding on Indian lands, like basically disrupting law and order and making it more difficult for the government and for officers and for national policy. But it was not their duty, either assigned or self-professed, to uphold the social hierarchy among white citizens in places untroubled by foreign menace. Spaniards, Britons, Canadians, Mexicans, and for a decade Texans were the soldiers or citizens of foreign nations infringing on American national sovereignty. Native Americans were defined as domestic dependent nations subordinated to federal authority by law and treaty, but culturally alien and denied citizenships, essentially foreigners being conquered by the United States. Slaves were a special case, obviously, culturally foreign, denied citizenship, as slaves denied citizenship. Irishmen, Catholics, and immigrants were another matter. However foreign they may have seemed to old stock Protestant officers in birth or culture or religion, or to Whiggish officers politically, the Irish, the Catholics, they had immigrated voluntarily under U.S. law. They had been permitted into the country to pursue citizenship, which was very easily obtained back then. It was pretty much, you're here 5 years and you're citizenship, none of that endless green card stuff, whatnot. Nowadays, whatever officers may have thought of them, of their class or their status, they were were visibly white, even if mistreated by a lot of their fellow citizens. And they made a growing proportion, ultimately at least half of the enlisted ranks in the Army, and they could call on the support of the Democratic Party that was very open to immigration at the time. So there are only two exceptions, and I'm going to talk about those and then wrap up. There are only two exceptions to this avoidance of riot duty. So I'm going to mislead you by now giving you a couple of examples. But again, only two, right? Only two exceptions. The first, when two companies of infantry were deployed to break up, actually they may have been artillery, but without their cannon. Were deployed to break up violent clashes among Irish laborers on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal near Williamsport, Maryland in January 1834. The financially troubled canal company, headed by Jackson's crony and former Secretary of War John Eaton, was cutting jobs. And 5 to 10 workers, it's not clear how many precisely, were killed in battles between rival Irish factions over who would remain from different parts of Ireland, essentially. They had, organized hiring was often by who you knew from the old California relationships. So the state militia responded first, but the local citizenry realized that the rioting would continue unless the force was continuously stationed along the canal. Unwilling to serve in or pay for such a presence themselves, right, wanting to, go about their lives and make their livings, they petitioned Maryland for federal action, and the legislature passed a resolution in support. So a very gradual process here. Jackson did respond quickly, dispatching the two companies from coastal fortifications in Baltimore, which means they were artillery, again, without their cannon, with orders to act in accordance with instructions from the local civil authorities. The troops remained for a couple of months, assisted in the arrest of approximately 30 rioters, but without ever using deadly force. This doesn't mean that officers were unwilling to intervene or that they felt their efforts were wasted. The unit's commander advised the adjutant general that, quote, tranquility is restored. And I think the unit's commander was Marcina Patrick, who became the provost marshal for the Union during the Civil War. Indeed, he felt the Army had won friends among the citizenry, for, as he said, the inhabitants, meaning not the Irish workers, but the local Maryland citizens, appear much gratified at the presence of the troops. The only substantial work on this incident remains that by Richard B. Morris, a labor historian writing back in 1949. Right, so you can see where people don't really think about this a whole lot. And in 1949, Jackson was considered the champion of the working man. So Morris used this case to question that interpretation. And that was his focus. He wasn't really concerned about the Army, what the Army was doing, why the Army was doing it. Or, his concern, the title of his article was Andrew Jackson, Strikebreaker, right? And the idea was, wow, Andrew Jackson, he wasn't a friend of the working man after all, or, to add some complexity to Jackson's image. But again, this incident was not characteristic of the Army's missions or interests. Violence resumed after the soldiers left the canal, but the Army did not return, and the C&O case remained the only deployment of the National Standing Army in a labor dispute or a strike before the Civil War. The most normative characteristic of the C&O deployment was the Army's subordination and accountability to civilian control, both generally and specifically, federally and locally, how quickly they responded, that they worked with the local authorities, and then they left. most innovative dimension of the mission was that the troops moved to Frederick, Maryland by railroad in 1834, which troops had actually moved in part by railroad to go to the Black Hawk War in 1832. But these are as far as I can tell, the first uses of the railroad by American military forces. The second exception to the Army's abstinence from repressing urban civil disorders during the so-called Riot Era, what historians have called the Riot Era, came in August 1835. With President Jackson absent in Norfolk, Virginia, Commanding General Macomb took the initiative to send companies from Forts McHenry and from along the Potomac and Alexandria and from Annapolis to, as he said, aid the civil authorities in suppressing open resistance to the laws of the city and state in Baltimore. And I'm not sure what this riot was over, but probably an election dispute. Macomb instructed the company commanders not to originate any movement of your own accord within Baltimore. So we're going to keep a tight rein on what they actually do. The great object, he said, being to restore order and to maintain the peace. It is expected that firmness on the part of the civil authorities, backed by the presence of the troops, not the troops up front, would succeed without, he said, proceeding to extremities, i.e., shooting at citizens or bayoneting them. The commanding general, who's stationed in Washington, dispatched Lieutenant Colonel John Fenwick to inform the president when disorder spread, or was rumored to have spread to Washington, where the federal marshal reported that a mob planned to attack the White House to seize blacks, African Americans, said to be secreted within. So someone actually spread a rumor that Andrew Jackson was protecting black people, and the rioters were going to attack. This shows you how strange all these things could be. Lacking further troops in the region, Macomb recalled a company from Baltimore, advising the cabinet that it could, quote, act in the streets along with the Marines from the Washington Navy Yard. But he recommended arming the civilian clerks of the executive departments, right? So the Title V employees, to protect property while, quote, maintaining the proper civil authorities rather than deploying the army against the rioters. Despite this desperate language, no military force, was employed, and there was no significant public reaction against the small deployment of national troops. So to sum up here, again, really we're explaining the dog that didn't bark, that's always hard to explain or a little bit speculative. But on the whole, Army officers in this era, they had partisan political beliefs. They certainly had, whatever prejudices or biases or ideological values. But they wanted to remain above or transcend partisan politics. And they wanted to appear impartial, and they wanted to avoid criticism from either side of the political spectrum. And that was also generally true of politicians. Again, for a politician, to call in the army and the army, shoots a bunch of people or bayonets a bunch of people, would at that point, I think ruin a politician's career. It's kind of hard to say. It never really happened but I think that suggests that, however desperate things may have seemed, or however much violence there was in the streets, no politician in the 1830s or 40s or 50s was actually going to call on the army to repress rioting. Again, this doesn't mean that the officers were not often very authoritarian. You see that certainly in how they treated their enlisted soldiers. But it does mean that their institutional and their professional interests were in staying above the fray, staying out of the fray, staying on the borders, staying on the frontiers, dealing with Native Americans who weren't citizens, who were, obviously denied citizenship at that point by the white majority, dealing with, Spaniards or Mexicans or Britons, people of other nations that they could deal with as representatives of the United States upholding American national sovereignty. And so with that, thank you, and I'll be delighted to answer any of your questions.
I have to assume that everyone in the audience, you answered or met their expectations, so there's no questions at this time. If anybody does have questions, I'd ask that you forward them to me or respond to the email of invite, and I'll pass them and get answers from the professor. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again for participating in this program. We're pleased with your 2 lectures, and for those in the audience, we'll be posting this up on our YouTube site in the next day or so. So if you want to pass it to your friends about watching it, please do. Any last comments, sir?
Oh, thank you all for watching, and so again, if you do have questions, certainly send them to Mike, and I'll be happy to answer them.